Hello and many thanks for joining us on the program People, Politics and Power. I am Imonia Marire. The second edition of the Russia-Africa Summit ended last weekend in Petersburg, St. Petersburg, Russia. The two-day summit was attended by African leaders from less than 20 countries, including Nigeria's Vice President Kashim Shettima, who stood in for President Bola Tinubu. The attendance at this year's summit fell far short of that of 2019, when 43 African heads of state and governments, 109 foreign ministers, and 8 African regional organizations participated in the summit. The just-ended summit was originally scheduled to hold in October 2022 in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa, but was postponed by the Russian leader Vladimir Putin following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in March last year and the consequent imposition of economic sanctions on Russia by Western countries and its ostracization by many other countries of the world. Organizers of the summit say it is aimed at rebuilding ties with the African continent and bringing about what they call a new level of mutually beneficial partnerships across all areas of society. There was also an economic and humanitarian forum alongside the summit, at which series of bilateral meetings between business leaders and senior Russian government officials took place. At the summit, African leaders reportedly pressed Putin to end the Ukraine war and restore the Black Sea grain deal that he tore up just a week before the summit. But they drew blank from a recalcitrant Putin. The Ukraine war has resulted in rising food prices in many African countries, as well as in the disruption of energy. The Russia-Africa Summit is just another in the series of single-country, one-continent summit relationships that Africa has been engaged in. Some of the others include the US, France, Japan, China, and India. Questions have been asked. Is Russia offering anything different from the others? And just like the others, is it Russia's intention? Are they genuine? Why is a continent of 54 countries with a population of about 1.3 billion called to meetings on their own development by single countries? Why are the meetings not bilateral? Now, some analysts have argued that the summits are designed to win back influence on the African continent. The new scramble for Africa, they call it, and for power projection, especially as the summits have become more promissory in nature without actual fulfillment. If so, why is Africa so subordinated? And why are African leaders so beggarly in their disposition? What do African countries stand to gain from countries that actively engage in undermining their growth and their stability? We shall explore the motivations for these engagements further with our guests who are right now very much with us. First is Professor Igor Natufe, who is joining us all the way from Moscow in Russia. He is a research professor at the Institute for African Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's a public policy analyst and author of several books, including Russian Foreign Policy in Search of Lost Influence and Soviet Policy in Africa. We're also joined by Dr. Adesua Erediawa. She's a senior research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome to the program. But first, Let's look at the unfolding events in Nigeria's backyard. And that's talking about Niger Republic. The ECOWAS, at its emergency meeting in Abuja last Sunday, issued a week's ultimatum to the coupists in Niamey to vacate power, or it will resort to the use of force to get them out. Now, how feasible is this, considering that the ECOWAS has no standing army or a standing military force? What dynamics does the Russian Wagner mercenary group's support for the coupists bring into play here? And where is the place of France in the scheme of things, being the colonial master and a very close ally of Niger, at least up till a week ago? These are questions we shall explore as soon as we return from this break. We shall be going straight into our discussion. And of course, we shall be having a soundbite from the ECOWAS summit, where, of course, the ECOWAS leaders spelled out what their line of action will be after 7 days. Thank you so much for staying with us. Let me once again welcome Professor Igor Natufe for joining us all the way from Moscow. He is a research professor at the Institute of African Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he is joined by Dr. Adesuwa Erediawa. Dr. Erediawa is a senior research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, NIIA, in Lagos. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. Now, so let's begin from our backyard here, from Niger Republic, where, of course, you know by now, there's been a coup and ECOWAS meeting last Sunday in Abuja, laid out a number of steps, including, of course, the possibility of taking action through the force of arms to restore power in Niger. Now, what would be your immediate reactions to that development? Professor Natufe.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Mr. Marere.
Go ahead, we can hear you, Prof.
Good. The coup in Niger did not come as a surprise, given the socio-economic and political developments we've been observing in that country for the past 3 decades, if not more than that. I will not focus on the range of coups in West Africa, but to directly address your question regarding ECOWAS ultimatum that they issued to the new regime in Niger. I consider this a very bad precedent, because should ECOWAS manage to organize itself and send troops from different countries into Niger, that will set a precedent in the sense that it will be looked on that further developments in West Africa that did not go to the liking of ECOWAS leaders will be dealt with by an ECOWAS military intervention. The basis for this intervention, according to ECOWAS, is that the regime there was illegal, a coup d'etat. But we have had, over time in West Africa, coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is not only when the military interferes in politics, it is also when civilian authorities illegally acquire power through hook and crook means in the electoral process. We have seen this in several African countries. That is a coup. A coup. A democracy is not judged by the number of elections held, but by the processes and the governance pattern in each country. So ECOWAS should be very, very careful in what they've decided to do. I'm sure that they must have been reading the tea leaves of the Western powers, so they're trying to preempt the West by doing what the West will do themselves. Again, I will stop for now and let my colleague from NIA chip in before I continue.
All right, thank you so much, Prof. Dr. Adesua, considering the fact that the ECOWAS as a body has no standing army, it has no standing force, how feasible is the threat of intervening forcefully to restore democracy in Niger? As you know by now, ECOWAS has imposed sanctions on Niger. It has imposed a no-fly zone, and it has also asked all its members to close their borders against Niger.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Also, ECOWAS has low political will. Okay, among, for example, I don't think ECOWAS will have, I doubt that ECOWAS will have the support of some of the Francophone countries like Burkina Faso. So generally, there's a low political will among the countries. Low funds is also another factor. And then, like you also mentioned, no standing army. And then also worthy of note is the fact that all the countries that make up the ECOWAS, all the member countries have their own internal issues that they're struggling with founded on bad governance, which is, we're not talking about that right now. So there is that, there's that low force generally from ECOWAS. And then, of course, I think that it was a situation where they had to say something and do something. So now we're asking, what are the chances that they can actually enforce any of these I don't know if I should call it threats in Niger. First of all, I would say that military intervention into Niger would not be a good idea for ECOWAS to do. I would say that a move that ECOWAS could make is to assess their interest in the conflict, okay? Fine, there's, for example, Nigeria, there's a lot of interest. We share a border with Niger. Katsina is a border with Niger. It's even almost difficult to identify the border. So there's a huge interest for Nigeria, at least. So ECOWAS should assess interest in the conflict and ensure the use of armed conflict is a last resort. And to do that, I would suggest opening all forms of dialogue on the issue, because we do not have the military force, the military might to attack or to enter into Niger. Considering the fact that Niger is obviously and evidently backed by Russian military forces. So even though ECOWAS wants to make and send a military consortium to ECOWAS, there should be no use of force. There should be no conflict. Even the presence of military, ECOWAS military, is even dicey, which is why I'm suggesting open dialogue, open all forms of dialogue. And then in the process of that, you may want to see reasons with the military junta that have taken open discussion and see reasons with them why they should restore democracy, and also like give them a soft landing. There should be conversations about the soft landing, because there will be defiance in their discussions. There will be defiance, knowing that their offense is punishable. You know, we all know what the punishment for treason is. So dialogue should be open, because there's a lot of interest for the ECOWAS member countries in this process. So dialogue should be open, and a soft landing should be given to them, hoping and assuming. I personally think that the Niger will respond to ECOWAS interventions as long as they are peaceful. So that's my take.
Dr. Adesua, considering the fact that
Yes, please.
efforts by ECOWAS at dialogue with similar situations in the past, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and even in Guinea, has not yielded much positive results. Why do you still think that dialogue should be the option, the way out at this point in time?
That is the exact reason why there should be no use of military force, because there have been coups in 6 coups in West Africa, in the region, since August 2020 to date. What has ECOWAS been able to do and to achieve in those cases? So what is the new interest, which I'm guessing we will talk about, in Niger that would call for the use of force? So I think that it's pretty. It might be obvious the extent of influence that ECOWAS may have in these regions, as far as these coups are concerned. Which is why I think dialogue, fine, show some, brandish a little military presence or something like that, military might, speak as one voice, brandish a little military might, but of course, take cognizance of the influence, because it's a situation where you speak or no speak, we're impacted by the conflicts that are going on. So we're sort of kind of jinxed, if I may put it that way. So that's why I'm thinking opening dialogue first, letting these military junta that are ruling see the need to restore democracy. We need to restore democracy and then grant them soft landing.
All right. Professor Onatufe, talking about dialogue, we're aware that after the summit in Abuja last Sunday, the president of Chad was actually mandated to speak with the leader of the military junta in Niger, and he did visit to pass on the message of the ECOWAS to the coupists in Niger. But of course, what the result has been that they have continued to talk tough. Now, put side by side with that of France, that the Nigerian coupists have also accused of trying to invade their country. What do you think will be the dynamics in this kind of mix? What should the French, or how should the French, which has been very, very closely related to Niger over the years and has, in fact, a military force in Niamey and has a lot of economic interest in Niger, be thinking of or be doing at this point in time?
Well, it's interesting that the president of Chad, who himself came into power via a coup. So here you have a coupist being assigned to go and discuss or negotiate with a coup leader of a neighboring country. So you can see the hypocrisy right there and the failure of policy or planning by the ECOWAS. Niger is obviously a very important country, not just to Nigeria, but also to France. We all know that in West Africa, particularly when you talk about the French-speaking West African states, the major enemy, or if you will, competitor that Nigeria has is France. It's not Niger or Cote d'Ivoire or Dahomey, Benin Republic or Guinea, but France. These countries are paralyzed by France. If these countries obtain their complete independence, France will fall back perhaps lower than any third world country if they withdraw their deposit from French banks. So when ECOWAS placed a no-fly zone over over Niger Republic, that draws a lot of remembrance to what happened in Libya. Will ECOWAS have the capability to bring down any plane flying over Niger territory? If a French plane is caught in that no-fly zone, what will ECOWAS do? You see, sometimes when a country gives an ultimatum that it cannot realistically stand by, it becomes a bluff, and it destroys the credibility of that country or group of countries at any time in international relations. Since Nigeria is the lead country now, how effective will this be in gauging Nigeria's foreign policy actions in the future? You know, someone had noticed that, well, who is going to listen to Nigeria at this time when its own president is battling against his legitimate or illegitimate stand in his own country? So, first of all, the sending of President Diaby from Chad to Niger is questionable in terms of optics. You know, my sister in Lagos, NIA, just said you should give them a safe landing. I will not describe it as a safe landing, because a safe landing, meaning that there's going to be a compromise. On what point will there be a compromise? A compromise that, well, we will bring back President Bazoum if ABC takes place. What will be the condition that Niger will present to such a request for a safe landing? In the first place, Niger will tell you, no safe landing, because we have found Mr. Bazoum guilty of ABC, or he's been prosecuted to court to face charges of economic malpractices. So this is not a civil war in Niger that you will send an ECOWAS peacekeeping forces like we had in Liberia some years ago. This is a different type of intervention. You know, you are trying to bring down the government of a different country. No matter how that government came into power, either through corrupt ballot box or by the gun. You see, I listened to Dr. Adesuwa injecting Russia into this quagmire in Niger Republic. Unfortunately, Africa has been a puppet of international organizations, countries. It is either a coup is viewed as a pro-Russian coup, or a pro-American coup, or a pro-French coup. Why can't we look at a pro-African coup? For example, is there anything in this coup that is pro-Niger interest? Forgetting about America, Russia, or France, for example. I think we should look beyond targeting these countries as either pro-America or pro-Russia, but looking at their policy and exactly what do they intend to achieve for their country's national development. First, before we look into who are their allies, internally or externally. But for us to just rush and say that it is pro-America or pro-French or pro-Russia will be disregarding the capability of any country in Africa to construct its own national interest policies. So that is my take on this question of Niger.
Dr. Adesua, I believe that your reading of the situation has to do with the fact that the only body, the only group that has so far expressed positive sentiments towards the coup in Niger is the Wagner mercenary group, which is, of course, a Russian group. And I believe that it's on that basis that many people think that the Wagner group may actually be acting on behalf of the Russian state.
Thank you. While many people may believe that the Wagner group is acting on behalf of the Russian state, we need to be reminded that the Wagner group is a private organization, though affiliated with the Russians. So there's a strong affiliation with the Russians. But to the extent of Russian influence over the Wagner group is still yet to be seen, considering the recent, considering how it seemed as though President Putin was incapacitated or is incapacitated towards their leader. But I want to point out that as dim as it seems that it looks for Africa, and considering what Prof said, very, very vital points whereby he said that Africa should be able to have their voice. It may seem to be that is exactly what Africa is doing. Africa might be, or Niger might be speaking up, saying this is what we want. Not just Niger, all those countries, the Sahel countries who are plagued by this recent, it may not be said to be the right, because it's obvious that democracy is liberty and freedom for the people is what we want to uphold as Africans, as ECOWAS. But these countries are making a choice. We don't want France. This is who we want. And I beg to say that it's difficult to not bring in external influences into this conversation. It's very obvious. I mean, the flags, apart from other indices, the comment by the Wagner leader, the tearing and burning of French flags, asking them to expelling of their troops from Niger, all of those point to the fact that, and plus much more, point to the fact that there is external influence in these conflicts, in these recent conflicts since 2020. But the point I'm trying to make is that Niger, for example, and I think though Africa should do the same thing about projecting the African interest in the right direction, of course, Niger is taking a step in what I would call the wrong direction in choosing what they want, albeit to be who they want in this case. But Prof is 100% correct in the sense that it should be a Nigerian interest, not just a foreign interest. But Niger is so really so set back. All those countries, they're so set back. They're poor, there's insecurity, there are a lot of insecurity issues, poverty, socioeconomic issues that may seem that they can handle on their own, And that's where Nigeria, ECOWAS, should have come in. Unfortunately, our house is so in disarray, so not put together. But this is where we should have come in to play big brother, as has been entrenched in our foreign policy and what ECOWAS is supposed to be doing. But like I said, there's mismanagement in a lot of, we need to set our house in order, basically. And because we have not set our house in order, it's difficult to play that role, that intervention role, that big brother role of Afrocentrism being our foreign policy thrust, because our house is not set in order. And I think I read that even the military junta leader commented on he made a comment about the illegitimacy of Nigeria's presidency. So that points to the fact that we need to sort in-house first.
Yeah. Well, if I may come in here, Mr. Mark Mara, I listened to President Ibrahim Traoré when he addressed the summit in St. Petersburg a few days ago. He was very blunt in his assessment of the failure of African leaders. He addressed African leaders who were there at the conference in St. Petersburg, that the failure of African leaders over the past years is responsible for most of the deficits we today have in African countries. And there's no way we can escape saying that. That is the truth. As I said earlier on, we cannot say that holding elections is all that we need in a democracy. It's one. So like what Dr. Adesuwa just underlined, as I said earlier on, you cannot condemn a regime as being illegitimate when you yourself lacks legitimacy. And we look at not just Nigeria, look at Ghana, for example. People have been talking about President Kofado and other West African leaders. So it was a bad advice that they issued this 1 week ultimatum. But we shall see at the expiration of 1 week. Again, African Union gave a 2-week ultimatum. So which one is going to be respected by Niger? Is it the ECOWAS 1 week or the African Union 2 weeks? So you can see here a disconnect in foreign policy formulation by both ECOWAS and African Union. One would have thought that they could have discussed that and come up with a concrete plan. So you don't have one giving 7 days, the other one giving 14 days ultimatum. It's just laughable. But I may be wrong, which I say in a week or two's time.
All right, Prof. Let's move over now to the Russia-African Summit, which, of course, just ended in St. Petersburg. But to also note very quickly that the question of legitimacy or illegitimacy in Nigeria does not arise now, in my view, because the court processes are still on. And if we know that the electoral process in Nigeria includes, of course, appeals to the courts for review of whatever grievances we have, then we must wait until the courts have decided before we talk about legitimacy or illegitimacy in the Nigerian electoral process. We cannot allow some persons in Niger to begin to denigrate Nigeria and denigrate its stature on the basis of what they have no idea of and no control over. But Prof, let me take you now to the Russia-Africa Summit. which has just ended in St. Petersburg in Russia, you note that the number of African leaders that attended this summit was far less than those that attended in 2019. About 43 African leaders, 109 foreign ministers attended in 2019, and in 2023, less than 20 of them are present. What do you think is responsible for that?
Well, my views on this summit, whether it is in Japan or China or US or Russia, I've maintained a consistent position that it is senseless to transport 50 or odd African leaders in a plane to meet with one person, whether it is in Washington or Russia, it doesn't matter. I consider that, again, a huge policy error by Africa. And I say this with due respect. I've said this at several fora here in Moscow. I would have expected that the AU Commission could have been the one to represent Africa, not to put 50 odd African heads of state with cap in hand discussing their economic situations with one person, one country. I find that degrading. I mean, we cannot escape mentioning the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, the so-called Scramble for Africa, which is still continuing. Because African states, in fact, what has replaced that Berlin Conference, which most people criticize of saying they divided Africa without Africans being present. But now Africans are organizing themselves to go to foreign countries to be divided. So, you know, as a political scientist, and I look at this, I sort of check my head, really, in disbelief. The fact that you had 40 odd countries in 2019 that came to Sochi, Russia, and in this year we didn't have that much number, we should situate that in the context of global politics today. The Ukraine-Russia war and the policy of America across African countries with the envoys that is sent, whether it is Victoria Nuland or Mr. Adeyemo or the Vice President Kamala Harris, to go and persuade African countries to boycott. But the fact that Nigeria attended is a good sign. It's a good sign in the sense that Nigeria attended to show its independence from the pressure being exerted on her by the US. We know not to attend. So that, to me, is a good sign. And let's ask ourselves, does Russia need Africa, or Africa needs Russia? Again, in my view, Russia needs Africa more than Africa needs Russia. The same as US needs Africa more than Africa needs US. The same as China needs Africa more than Africa needs China. But the failure of Africa to construct a viable policy that defines itself is responsible for the way Africa is being tossed around from Moscow to Washington to Beijing to Tokyo. You know, I'm not looking at the summit per se, but I'm looking at the embodiment of the summit. Summit is good, but it should be based on a certain principle of equity and reciprocity. You cannot ask me to be coming to your house every year for the meeting. You won't come to my house for a follow-up meeting. Something is wrong there.
All right, Prof. Let me bring Dr. Adesua in now. Prof has just asked a very salient question. Does Africa need Russia, or how much does Russia need Africa? Why should it be a one country, a whole continent summit relationship and not bilateral?
Yes, thank you very much. I totally agree with Prof that Russia needs Africa more than Africa needs Russia. Right now, Russia is neglected by the West because of the war in Ukraine, and it's the war in Ukraine since last year. Russia is seeking relevance on the global front, and unfortunately, Africa seems to have set herself as a pawn, to be used to gain this relevance that Russia is seeking. I think personally that, just like Prof said again, that summoning the entire African nation to Russia to come and be divided, that's exactly the point I'm trying to get, to come and be divided. Africa should be speaking with one voice. Africa should be setting an African agenda, for their own interest, for Africa's own interest. But unfortunately, it seems as if Africa's bargaining power is limited, very limited. Okay. First of all, there's and by bargaining power, I don't just mean economically, which I, of course, am going to go into the economics of it, why I say Africa needs Russia. And not just Africa needs Russia, Nigeria needs Russia, Russia needs Nigeria, and this should be on a bilateral framework, not summoning the entire nation. But like I said, Africa has lost bargaining power, and a lot of this is because of the history, the issue of bad governance among African nations. Okay, so bad governance and our inability to speak with one voice, our inability to formulate our own agenda for what we want and come together and speak with that one voice. And a lot of it is founded on our leadership and governance issues. And then, but I would also say that Africa needs Russia, Nigeria needs Russia. Of course, Russia needs us more than we need them. What Russia has done is to play is to use its grains and its military might as a diplomatic tool to gain relevance in the globe. But we, Africa, Nigeria, should be able to use our resources, our oil, as a diplomatic tool in the globe as well. But the problem now is that we as Africa as a nation, we have not risen. Fine, I think personally that we are beginning to dictate what we want, but there's still a long way for us to go to come together, formulate our agenda, to put our house in order. So the reason why Russia is able to use, in spite of the fact that Russia is using its grain as a diplomatic tool, among other things, it still went ahead to defy the efforts of the seven African presidents led by President Ramaphosa to bomb to cancel the Black Sea grain deal. That just goes to show that we do not have our bargaining power. So that's why I said it was not just economic. Our bargaining power in the global front is really limited, and we need to start to come together to put our house in order, speak as one voice, and look within to build our bargaining power.
All right. There are those who believe, for instance, that the summits have just become issues of prestige and power projection as far as the big powers are concerned vis-a-vis Africa. For instance, between 2019 and now, the trade relationship between Russia and Africa has been limited to mainly 4 African countries. And that's talking about Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and South Africa. And that trade balance has contracted from 2019 until now to just about $14 billion. That's what it has been. In other words, Russia has been benefiting from this relationship more than the African countries have been benefiting. It's been more lopsided in favor of the Russians, with Russia exporting about 7 times what to Africa, what it gets from Africa. So is that a relationship that we should continue to nurture as a continent?
Well, my dear brother Mark. In any trade relationship, you always find a party that gains more than the other one. If you take US-Africa relations, for example, trade relations, you will get the same picture. If you take China-Africa relations, you will get the same picture. And of course, you will get the same picture taking French investment in Africa or trade with African countries, you will get the same result. So take Niger, again, we are back to Niger. Is uranium keeps France going forward. That same uranium is responsible for Niger's backwardness, if I may say so, because of its incapability of exploiting its own resources. And that is what keeps the French economy going. All these countries, Russia, France, America, China, Germany, you name it, they all have the same objectives. One is that they come into Africa to challenge competitors who are from the other big powers. They come to Africa to extract Africa's economic benefits. They come to Africa to establish political and military affiliations with African countries. And they come to Africa to enhance their respective power and influence globally, all of them. So you see, when we study foreign policy, it's a very interesting field. You see, we cannot just say, oh, Russia wants to gain influence. What about America? What about China? Who doesn't want to gain influence in global politics? Then stop playing in the big league. If you don't want to gain influence, then stay in your backyard. Nigeria wants to gain influence in West Africa for a long time. You know, when I go back my teaching days at Uniben, some of my students wrote theses, brilliant papers on Nigeria's foreign policy in West Africa, and they all came to the same conclusion for power and influence, challenging French influence in West Africa. So let us focus on the issue of national interest. If we are unable as African countries or as Nigerians to safeguard our national interest, then we shouldn't blame Adesua, for example, from a foreign country to exploit our resources. You see, when I compare the CARICOM, that is the Caribbean Association, equivalent to the ECOWAS or the African Union, there is more internal policy discussion and external projection of their identity in the CARICOM than we have in ECOWAS or in the AU. So we have to go back and reconstruct our strategic interest in the world. I cannot end without referring to my a mentor of most of us, Kwame Nkrumah. When you read Nkrumah's speeches and compare it to what we have today in Africa, you weep for the continent.
All right, Prof. Thank you so much. Let me turn to Dr. Adesua. Adesua, what would be your final thought on this? If you had the opportunity of advising the African leaders today vis-a-vis their relationship with these other big powers, Russia, USA, France, Japan, China, that are always inviting them over to their countries for summits every now and then. I'm sure that after Russia, one other country, in fact, we understand that Brazil is preparing to also establish the similar relationship with African leaders. What would be your advice to them?
I would say that as these countries, our focus right now is Russia, have played power using their resources, played power using grain deals and supply of grain to Africa, played power using their military might. African nations should be able to use. We have comparative advantage. We should be able to use what we have comparative advantage in to play as a diplomatic tool with these countries. We should, for example, Nigeria, I say again, Nigeria should use its oil as a diplomatic tool. But first of all, we have to get things together. So I think that as a closing remark, in addition to that, I would say that my African leaders need to come together, speak with one voice, look inward, and set up a self-determined African agenda using what we have comparative advantage over these other nations in. We should also use that as a tool to get to the point where we say we want to summon other countries, summon China, summon France, summon Russia to have a trade negotiation, to have discussion, just like they're summoning on us. So another point I would like to make is we have to set up this African agenda with the aim of projecting our own interest. There's always an interest. So in the case of Niger, and as we see, Russia may be offering a better price. It all comes down to trade. Okay, Russia may be, or other nations, other Western nations may be offering a better price for what they have and what they've had for so long, uranium, that hasn't been able to improve their welfare, or their lives, or their country. Mm-hmm. The highest bidder, who is pricing the best, with the best interest, with the best benefits, they should be able to determine who they would trade with. And I think that is that is a step, I may not say in the right direction, for working in the direction of personal national interests.
Thank you so much, Dr. Desua Erediawa. He is a senior research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, NIIA, in Lagos. Thank you so much for your time. And Professor Igor Natufe, who joined us all the way from Moscow in Russia. He's a research professor at the Institute of African Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is a public policy analyst and author of several books, including Russian Foreign Policy in Search of Lost Influence and, of course, Soviet Policy in Africa. I want to thank you, Prof, for giving us your time at this moment. Thank you so much, Dr. Desua, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for having us. Right. Thank you.
Okay, and that's our program for today. We'll see you again when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power. Bye for now.